DeAndre Hopkins is a Kansas City Chief, and we are going to talk about that, the fallout of it, and some other potential trade scenarios we would like to see happen prior to the trade deadline, which is Tuesday, the 5th of November, 4 p.m. Eastern, Sean. So there's plenty of time to go in. We did record back-to-back shows on Monday. We thought we'll squeeze these shows in prior to Monday Night Football. We'll talk through some things. Little did we know lots was going to happen on Monday Night Football. Then there was going to be a trade of DeAndre Hopkins to the Chiefs. There's lots of movement, lots of trade rumors, but it's pretty fun because for many years, Sean, we were wondering, are the NFL teams ever going to make trades? Trades used to be like a very rare occurrence, and now we're seeing lots of them happening and teams making those moves, kind of similar to if you're looking at your dynasty leagues and how to build out those rosters. So we'll get Sean's thoughts on the Hopkins trade. We'll talk through some of the others. Sean, the key part I have to kick off here, we talked on Monday about the Minnesota Vikings. Sean wanted Nick Mullins to be coming in and replacing Sam Darnold on the 5-1 Minnesota Vikings. Did you start the Matthew Stafford trade rumors? Was that something Shawn Siegele did on a burner account on Twitter?
Got a few other stealth accounts out there. So I thought, why not fire up some Matthew Stafford rumors? Colm, Matthew Stafford looked completely done and also completely uninterested in week 7. I do think he would be a significant upgrade on Sam Darnold, but certainly not the upgrade he would have been through the vast majority of his career. Now, I'm hopeful that once they get Cooper Kupp back, and it does seem like Puka Nacua might not be that far away, that one of the things we could get would be, well, a functional offense, and that might help Kyren Williams. He has really strange peripherals at this point where, because of the offensive line, because of the overall offensive context, he's meeting defenders deep in the backfield. There is no respect for the passing game. His yards per attempt are awful, and yet he's been a little bit of magic too. And every time they do get a shot in the red zone, you think about some of your teams where you're thinking, well, if they could just get into the red zone, I'd have a shot. Maybe we could get a Trey McBride touchdown. Maybe we could get a Brock Bowers touchdown. You're not going to get those things. Kyren Williams, even if their team like barely sniffs that side of the field the vast majority of the game, he's going to somehow come out with 2 touchdowns. Part of that is obviously very lucky, but part of it is his unbelievable nose for the goal line, if you want to say it that, but the vision as he finds that tiny crease and gets across that line, the short yardage from Williams, especially for a smaller back, is pretty extraordinary. Colm, he is scoring extremely well, especially when you consider where he is from a yardage perspective, especially when you consider that he is either at or just below the top of the running back position in routes, and yet for the whole season, and yet he was not even targeted in week 7. We'll see what Matthew Stafford can do. I do not believe that he'll be leaving the Rams or that he'll be heading to the Vikings, but that would be a lot of fun. Would Matthew Stafford be an upgrade right now on Sam Darnold?
I'll say that, we had a fun back and forth on it earlier this week. I think he would be an upgrade, but you mentioned his plays, like particularly this week, but this season hasn't been great. But it feels like it's almost the inverse of the Miami Dolphins situation where they have no quarterbacks, so the wide receivers can't do anything. He has a running back who can punch it into the end zone, Sean, but there's very little for him at wide receiver. So if he gets Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp back, I think that changes the picture of how we're looking at Matthew Stafford. But we've talked about this for a few years now. As the season goes on, sometimes that arm just wears down bit by bit as you move through it. We're kind of at the halfway point now. So it'll be interesting if it happened, but I cannot see a situation where the Vikings make a quarterback move here with things as they are for the team and for Sam Darnold. Hopefully they get TJ Hawkinson back in the mix this week. They are playing on Thursday Night Football, but they his 21-day practice window ends on Friday, so they may not have him active for Thursday Night Football, but should be back at the latest on Friday. So that's quite exciting. Sean, You mentioned Cooper Kupp. I think we'll talk about him in a minute because I think there's a possibility that he could end up being on the move here. So maybe Stafford only gets one of those wide receivers back. But DeAndre Hopkins lands with the Kansas City Chiefs, has been with the Titans this season, last season. Obviously, I would say a shell of his former self, but his former self was one of the best wide receivers in the NFL for kind of a decade range in terms of the contested catch, the upside, particularly with him in Houston, but he had some big plays as well at times with the Arizona Cardinals, but definitely on the winning side of his career. But they're acquiring him for a 5th round pick that could turn into a 4th round pick. So value wise, I think is pretty fine for a team that are 6-0 and heading towards another playoff run, potentially the 1st overall seed and heading towards another Super Bowl chase. But we did talk earlier this week about Patrick Mahomes, how the offense has struggled, stagnated potentially, how the defense is, helping them a lot. They are being pretty efficient overall in offense in terms of the metrics there. But the big questions I think that people will be looking at here is DeAndre Hopkins comes in. How much can he help in terms of Patrick Mahomes? How much can he help maybe take some of the pressure off Xavier Worthy now that Rashee Rice is out? Juju Smith-Schuster was there, but now he's out for a period of time. They are really banged up across the board at the wide receiver position, and Travis Kelce hasn't been able to do a huge amount as of yet. So my question is kind of, how do you see this shifting around the Chiefs offense? And in my opinion, this is a better reality acquisition than what it's going to do fantasy-wise. I think the Chiefs may continue in the mold that we have seen so far this season for the rest of the fantasy season, but then obviously on your other side as a Kansas City Chiefs supporter, I think in terms of the Super Bowl aspirations, there's very little downside to this move.
Little downside other than DeAndre Hopkins, especially in the second half of his career, is a renowned locker room cancer. So,
So you're telling me that's not a good thing?
Some teams don't prefer it. Andy Reid is really good with managing difficult personalities.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, when you have Andy Reid, when you have Patrick Mahomes, when things are going to be fine, whether or not you have DeAndre Hopkins.
Shawn, I mentioned they're turning into the Patriots earlier this week. Is this another thing like, he's a real problem off the field, but Bill Belichick, he'll sort him out. So Andy Reid is now it's turning into full 2000s Patriots mode here.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We'll see if, they approach it from 2 different directions where Bill Belichick is like, we'll let you come play for us. And you have to understand that I am the tyrant. And the first time that you step a toe, not over the line, but on the line, you're going to be gone. At least that's what you hear or would always hear coming out of New England. Sort of the opposite with Andy Reid, where he's a player's coach. Not to say that he lets them get away with things, but I think that he does have, there are multiple reasons that Andy Reid is one of the greatest coaches of all time. He certainly is at the very top when you look at over a multiple decade view of someone, first of all, in terms of overall offensive scheme, and then secondly, as the play caller within that scheme, which are 2 connected but certainly different things. He's also a great leader. And that part is in many ways equally important. You think about what Mike Tomlin has been able to do for the Steelers, and we kind of joked on the Sunday night Stealing Bananas about how all of the rhetoric that we were getting from Monday night commentary was so ridiculous. Just because that commentary was ridiculous doesn't mean that Mike Tomlin isn't a great leader, because he obviously is. With Andy Reid, you have that plus the ability to be one of the greatest football coaches of all time. So you put those things together, and it is a good spot for DeAndre Hopkins. It could potentially help the Kansas City Chiefs. One of the things that we have to understand here is that on a Tennessee Titans team that needed receiving weapons DeAndre Hopkins was very much a peripheral piece. Now, some of these things have to do with injury and trying to get Hopkins to 100%. But part of the problem with Hopkins is that he's not just old, he's probably not healthy. And you look at the routes from just this last week, right? In a winnable game where you have an actual like borderline NFL quarterback out on the field for the Titans, 33 routes from Calvin Ridley, 29 from Tyler Boyd. Again, these are Sports Info Solutions numbers. They may differ slightly from some other things that you're looking at. DeAndre Hopkins, 22. That's the same number as Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Ikhine targeted 4 times as often, which many listeners are going to quickly be like, well, that's obviously 4-1, right? 14 targets for Tyler Boyd and Calvin Ridley combined, 1 target for Hopkins. He loses yards on it. That's kind of where we are right now for DeAndre Hopkins.
Has a fumble as well.
Well done, DeAndre. So
people may also say that, oh, well, this was in the works prior to last week, and maybe the team was like making sure he didn't get hurt. But I don't know if they're doing that for the sake of a 5th round pick.
Yeah. And I mean, he played. It's one of those deals where you played too much to be getting saved and not enough to be an actual starter on your own bad team. So, again, that's not great. The previous week, he does draw the 6 targets, the 54 yards. He actually has some air yards in that week. He runs about the same number of routes as Ridley and Boyd. So, there could be a tiny bit to what you're saying there. All we have to do is look back to Juju Smith-Schuster and where he was with the Patriots and then where he was quickly with the Chiefs to understand that it's apples and oranges and that the Chiefs are absolutely desperate. If you have someone who can come in and soak up some of the targets where the defense is saying, basically, we don't care. I mean, that's the thing with Juju Smith-Schuster. When you're trying to stop the Chiefs, and as you pointed out, teams haven't really been that successful stopping them, even with how lackluster the passing game has been. You look at them right now, teams are not afraid of Juju Smith-Schuster. They're not afraid of Kareem Hunt. They will let those guys perform. And the Chiefs are not going to run away from you. The problem that you have on the other side is simply, are you going to be able to keep up anyway? And when you don't have the mistakes, then the answer is probably not. So the mistakes on the Chiefs side, we did have several games this past week where teams that somewhat looked like they were controlling the game. You think back to Monday Night Football, which happened after we recorded last, and the Chargers, if you don't have that fumble at the 3-yard line, they probably not run away with that game. They weren't scoring particularly well, but they would be in control in a very different way. There'd be more pressure on Kyler Murray, who, I mean, it's been very helpful to them that he's had a couple of those long touchdown runs because
they've had nothing outside of that.
Yeah. Colm, as we have this discussion here, there is, I mean, obviously this is never going to happen, but you talked about dream trades. On Monday Night Football, we got images of Marvin Harrison performing in a way that even George Pickens would probably be embarrassed by. This isn't a good thing for the Cardinals, right? Do you have any dream trade scenarios? I mean,
Are you insinuating that the Cardinals should already trade away Marvin Harrison after 7 weeks? Is that where he's missed some time?
Well, if you're the Kansas City Chiefs, why not send 2 first-round picks plus for Marvin Harrison? That's probably an overpay. Marvin Harrison does not look good, right? He doesn't play hard in most of that game, and then when he does have an important opportunity for a catch late, he drops it, which has been mostly what he's done to this point. But you're not going to give up on him this early unless you get something huge back. It's always that question of, like, what are you giving up? Because it's not just the player involved. And this relates back to dynasty fantasy football as well, where people will put out their trade bait. They'll put out, these are the guys who are untouchable. And you're like, well, it's untouchable, but what if I offered 4 first-round picks? Yeah, the player should be available at the right price, right? Especially if you are rebuilding, then what does a star who could lose value? One of the things that was so hard, I thought, this week watching the Dolphins was not just Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill having no catches until deep in the game, drawing no targets for the vast majority of the game, the Dolphins losing as a result. But you also have Odell Beckham out there drawing targets. And it's one of these deals where, it probably doesn't matter. You want people to live their lives, to experience joy in every moment, and that you have a choice, right? Go out there and do the things that bring you joy. Hopefully for Odell Beckham, that's football. There is an element where people who are being introduced to football now, certainly in the last, even 4 to 5 years, they're never going to understand what Odell Beckham was and have that perception of him, because he has played long beyond when he was a legitimate NFL football player. And even for people who experienced it, our perception of Odell Beckham is as this broken down guy who occasionally draws a target that he probably won't catch. And this is a player who in his first 2 years in the NFL was probably the greatest receiver of all time.
He was Justin Jefferson, a different style of player, but he was what we look at Justin Jefferson as now. Justin Jefferson's probably done it for a year longer at this point, but that was how you thought of OBJ.
For me, I would say that I think that Justin Jefferson is actually a little better, but the production from Odell Beckham was superior. Whatever it was he had, and certainly people know the iconic catch, but beyond that, during his run as a rookie, there were all of these broken plays in the red zone where he wasn't even covered, and the quarterback would drop back and we're not sure why you didn't cover Odell Beckham inside the 10-yard line, but I am going to toss the ball over to him. So, there were some plays like that maybe padded the numbers a little bit, but Beckham across his first 2 seasons was this transcendent superstar. Guys who weren't like that but were amazing, people like Hakeem Nicks, people like Kenny Britt. If you're not in a position to win right now with your dynasty team, you should be moving the pieces that get you the absolute maximum return. Not, sitting like a dragon in your cave on the little bit of treasure that you do have, because by the time your team is competitive, people A, may know that Marvin Harrison is actually a bust, or B, he could have played well for a couple of years and then injuries take their toll. Sammy Watkins was one of the all-time great prospects coming out of college and did do some things in his first couple of years despite poor quarterback play. But even then, he was already struggling with injuries. And beyond that, he basically did nothing. Even though he had a few moments with the Chiefs later on, he had some moments with the Rams. But you're talking about someone who was expected to be Marvin Harrison, and he was just a guy his entire NFL career, which wasn't that long. So
the interesting thing, Shawn, on that, I did pull this up because when you mentioned Sammy Watkins, I was like, I think he went 4th as well. So they were both 4th overall picks. So the range of outcomes here could be Odell Beckham, Sammy Watkins, or maybe it goes on to turn around and be Justin Jefferson. It's interesting though when you're talking about it in those terms, in terms of people who have him on their dynasty rosters, or the Cardinals having them on their franchise, and be thinking about, well, we took him at 4, it's going to turn around, he's worth this now, he's going to be worth that in 2 years, or worth more than that. And it can be a case where it just crashes down and down and down and down. I still think that Harrison will be fine, but there's a lot of concerning things around him. One of the concerns that I've mentioned quite a bit is his quarterback and Kyler Murray from an actual NFL quarterback play. But the interesting thing when we look around, the situation with Hopkins, both you mentioned some of the stuff with the Titans now that he's no longer there. I don't think it necessarily is going to free up a lot for a Calvin Ridley breakout or anything like that. I think that the Titans are just in a very bad situation where they have some players who are not going to get the production. And I feel like Ridley with the quarterbacks tailored into that is going to be part of that equation. Hopkins going to the Chiefs, again, good real life move. There will be some touchdown receptions, and a bit like you're saying with the Russell Wilson stuff, like people will, it will get publicity, it will get social media clicks, that it is Mahomes to Hopkins, for example. But I think in terms of we're at the winning end of Hopkins' career, but that could be enough to get the Chiefs to a Super Bowl. But
well, Colin, as you mentioned that, I do want to say that Tennessee has the number 1 remaining schedule among wide receivers. And so
they may also have the worst wide receiver core in the league.
Well, the thing with Calvin Ridley is that he's probably much more a name right now and much more, air yards than he is a star. And yet you can see the speed, and you do have that built-in volume to where you might not actually have to be very good to be pretty viable across the second half, especially if your options otherwise are not great, and especially if your team overall is strong enough that you can live with the boom bust element of it. I think that there has to be some hope, and even if the hope is misplaced, regardless of who plays quarterback the rest of the way for the Titans, the quarterback play almost has to be better, even if it's only slightly better than what it's been to this point, because it's been Deshaun Watson level bad. And I don't think that the guys they have, even though they shouldn't be starting for NFL teams, can manage Deshaun Watson level play the rest of the way. You're going to be a little better than that. And so, it is vaguely interesting, I think, for Ridley. I also don't know that it actually affects Xavier Worthy hardly at all. One of the things last week that we talked about, he did have a lot of targets that didn't turn into much. I don't think that the kind of targets they're looking to get to Worthy will be impacted by having Hopkins on the field. If Hopkins is successful, mostly I think what it will do is allow them to not call so many running plays and therefore potentially lengthen the game slightly, which would be good for Worthy. Perhaps it allows you to convert some more third downs, keep some drives going. That could potentially be good for Worthy. And if Hopkins, because of the name, draws a little bit more defensive attention than Juju did, that also could potentially be good for Worthy. The thing that you need for Worthy is for him to play well and continue to improve, and you need, when he's wide open, for Patrick Mahomes to hit it. Those things, I think, are completely separate from DeAndre Hopkins, even though, does this keep Worthy now from having a string of games with 15 targets? It probably does. I think that was a very small possibility even before the trade.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. Shawn, you mentioned a couple of things there about Monday Night Football as we're going along, and the show was recorded after. I've been mentioning this every time it's happened over the last couple of weeks that they've played some NFC teams, but the Ravens get another win against the NFC. Shawn, Lamar Jackson now 23-1 all time against the NFC, which I continue to mention. It's a pretty crazy number. He had the 5 passing touchdowns. Derrick Henry runs wild for 169 yards. Love to see him getting the receiving touchdown. Get the big man out there in space. Mark Andrews got the 2 touchdowns. But the biggest bummer of this whole thing, and a player that we've talked about a lot, that we actually had to remove a portion of our show from earlier this week talking about him as a dynasty value, that was Chris Godwin. Really, a bummer to see him get hurt in the way he did at the end of that game this week. So that was very unfortunate, and one of those, you never want to see injuries, but it was one, surprisingly for me, that really took the wind out of my sails for quite a bit of time after the fact, and still is a real bummer. One of, we're talking about people who've watched the NFL for a long time, and Chris Godwin's there quite a bit of time, but he's been a facet of the fantasy football conversation for many years. So wishing him well and that recovery.
And hopefully everyone knew that I was mostly, joking with Blair as we did the guillotine draft. But as Lamar Jackson was putting up all of those points, I was thinking that I did need to make a sort of equally humorous apology to Blair for criticizing his selection of Lamar Jackson, to give folks a sense of why you might not take a QB. Even Lamar Jackson, the free agents available right now. Colm, on my team, in part because you can build these guillotine leagues in a variety of goofy ways, I have Kirk Cousins, Patrick Mahomes, Anthony Richardson, and Drake May. None of those guys is viable in the way that obviously Lamar Jackson is. Joe Burrow, Jared Goff on waivers in this league. In our other league, basically half of the QB1s are on waivers. Needless to say, Blair did not have any trouble with the cut line this past week. I did escape. Colm, I'm still alive in all 3 of the RotoViz radio leagues. I have had a variety of near-death experiences, as they put it in the guillotine lingo. Your team's doing quite well. You've got quite a bit of bidding flexibility. We'll see who Colm goes big on this week. A schedule matters, right? As the Bucs were putting it on Baltimore early on Monday night, they had the chance with the touchdown to Godwin that gets called back. Then they have another opportunity to either get a field goal or perhaps a touchdown. Baker Mayfield forces the ball into coverage in the end zone, gets a pick. That game could have been a little bit different, especially if you don't get the early injury to Mike Evans. But on the Ravens side, number one, Lamar Jackson looks absolutely fantastic. And Derrick Henry in an offense where the team, again, this is the difference between establishing the run and establishing your offense and letting the run destroy people, because Derrick Henry is a world burner with what we have going on right now. It is worth noting that this is the same team that Kirk Cousins threw for 500 yards against a couple of weeks ago. So by land and by sea, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to be a plum matchup as we work through the rest of this season. I
will put one asterisk in there. Kirk Cousins also had overtime to get some extra yards on that, but 500 yards, yeah, very impressive. Look, Derrick Henry, Shawn, 30 years old, the running back cliff, all that good stuff. Derrick Henry on Monday Night Football putting up some of the highest speeds of his career on that long run that he had. So, yeah, he might not be slowing down anytime soon, but he is.
The crazy thing, too, is that, the long runs do help you, right? You look at the highest speeds every year, and most of them are on the big plays. So if you get out there on the edge, you got a chance to get that speed up. He looked so fast. You expected him just to be gone. When that final player came out and had the angle, like, that is surprising. The way that he's running, I expected him to have left the entire defense behind back here. It's really cool to see, right? It's a phenomenal story. And one of the things that you always have to keep in mind when you're talking about trends, you're talking about averages, you're talking about cohorts that do this and that, is that does not in any way formalize a destiny for a specific player. And I am hoping one of the big stories over the last 24 hours, which in some ways is kind of a bummer, but Alvin Kamara signing the contract extension, if you can go through age 25 to 30 without meaningfully getting hurt, or for whatever reason, the injury you do suffer, because Derrick Henry did have a major injury, isn't one that will not allow you to get back to full strength. And then you do the work, you do the training as diets continue to get better, or understanding, or our not actually enforcement, but the willingness of elite athletes to follow some of the nutritional information. And then as workouts get better, they're not going to get dramatically better, but you don't necessarily have to be dramatically better if you get somewhat fortunate and then you're willing to work hard in a disciplined way where the work is going in the right direction. That certainly seems to be what Henry has done. And
I don't think if Henry's workouts can probably get better, he's doing some sort of futuristic stuff here. He's creating the workouts for future generations. That's what it certainly looks like. The other crazy thing about the Baltimore Ravens, before we move on, is that this is a team that lost to the Las Vegas Raiders, which is just seems like an anomaly at this point. But The player
Sean lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's also hard to understand right now.
Well, one of those teams is better than the other. The player, Sean, that I have highlighted, you may have some other names to suggest in here. You touched on Cooper Kupp coming back for the Rams earlier in the show, and I think that is likely to be the case. But there have also been some rumors, reports of Cooper Kupp potentially being on the move. You know, obviously an aging wide receiver as well. Maybe the Rams looking to see if they can get something back in return to maybe help them in the future. The other players that I've down is Diontae Johnson, obviously just joined up with the Panthers this year, has been much better since we had the quarterback change to Andy Dalton. Darius Slayton has had some good performances for that Giants team in the absence of Malik Neighbors. Christian Kirk is somebody who, with the Jaguars and how their season has started, you know, I think his contract is pretty tradable in terms of the next 2 years of salary and next year's salary not fully guaranteed. And then when we look around, well, Mike Williams is another name that I've added in there, Sean. Not going to be the most exciting one, I'm sure, for you to talk to. I've put him at the end of the list. But I do think that some teams may look to field some, you know, calls towards the deadline if they haven't been able to get somebody for a target like that. But we talked about the Ravens. They're obviously playoff bound at this point. They're 5-2 after an 0-2 start. You know, they had Zay Jones, who was very limitedly involved in the passing game. They've had Mark Andrews step forward. They've a lot of tight end play, Bateman stepping up, but maybe one of, you know, a veteran wide receiver could help that crew. We have the Dallas Cowboys, you know, with bits and pieces out to the CD Lamb. We have Tolbert. They are 3-3, and they are going to be really, I think it's an uphill battle for them to make it there. Their odds are less than 20% of this current record to make it through to the playoffs. Denver Broncos, we've talked about the wide receiver situation there and Bo Nix, but they are in the hunt for the playoffs. The Pittsburgh Steelers, if we keep getting these Russell Wilson moonballs to George Pickens, who that could have been, DeAndre Hopkins could have suited there, Sean. That could, he's another player could do with that. You mentioned you and Ben joking about it. We didn't get to joking about it on OT because I was still tilting after watching the performance as to how people were talking about the greatness of the Russell Wilson show on Sunday night, which a lot of moonballs and prayers, hoping they were going to get answered. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as we mentioned, unfortunately lose out on Chris Godwin. They now have Mike Evans injured. A lot of young players there on that roster. You know, McMillan and co can step up, but they may want to add another additional player in there. And the other one, Sean, that I would love to see another wide receiver landing in would be the Washington Commanders. They're 5-2. They've Jaden Daniels. They're really on the run here. They would probably be one of my favorites if we got one of those names, the likes of a Kupp or a Johnson, to land there for the rest of the season. And the other name I've put in here being the Chargers, but I don't think that's as exciting for fantasy football. I think fantasy-wise, you know, the Washington Commanders is where I want to see one of those guys land. Any teams outside of those, any players outside of those, and then we can talk about maybe where we would slot some of those guys in.
Yeah, I think that the Commanders are pretty interesting in that they have been so much better than expected. Their division has been so much worse than anticipated, and receiver is a clear weakness there. So that's probably a prime location. You look through many of the other teams, the Dallas Cowboys could really use a secondary option. The Broncos are a good team, and I think that they are positioned to make the playoffs in a way that probably the Chargers, after blowing that game on Monday night, are not. And the Chargers probably are also, just by virtue of the fact that their head coach is in his first year, whereas Sean Payton in his second and is kind of needing to make some noise, the Chargers are probably more likely to be patient, even though receiver is a huge problem on their squad as well.
And with the Chargers, I think they're multiple years away in a building process, but I think realistically the Commanders are, but because of how good Jaden Daniels has been, it feels like they have, like, you know, we talk about in the dynasty shows arriving early, and it feels like the Commanders are a team that are arriving early, but they may just be a few pieces short from. And the thing is, too, you never know those windows. You know, look at the Commanders for an example, and I think that what Jaden Daniels is doing is more sustainable than what we're seeing with RG3. But then obviously Daniels did get injured this week. But you see like how fragile those windows can be in terms of being open. And maybe if you are heading into the playoffs this year, you got to go for it.
Definitely. The entire NFC North is fantastic. The entire rest of the NFC, pretty tragic. One of the ways that the Ravens continue to rack up all of those victories there. The Steelers need a receiver badly. And I completely agree with you that Hopkins would have fit there. In a lot of ways, it's pretty useless to add someone like Cooper Kupp to the Steelers since, Russell Wilson is just going to throw punts up there. A route runner is not what he needs. Someone like a DeAndre Hopkins with the arm length, the ability to get up there and make those contested catches. That's what will work with that style.
And that's what I'd have all those names. That's where I think Mike Williams might fit in. I think he could fit in with the Steelers. Yeah,
I think that's a good call. Even though Mike Williams probably is just bad, but
another reason why he would fit on the Steelers.
Right. Good point. The hard part here is that the two teams that probably still make the most sense if you didn't know what had already happened, including the new guys who were on their teams. But the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs are still the teams that need receivers among teams that are legitimate Super Bowl contenders, right? I doubt that we're going to get an additional pickup, although if it's cheap enough, the cost for Hopkins should not keep the Chiefs out of the Cooper Kupp sweepstakes if they have any interest.
No.
Cooper Kupp is the name that I wanted to see there. Maybe you look at that and say, Cooper Kupp is much less likely to actually play games. He hasn't been able to stay on the field at all in the last 3 years. Even with how bad and injured Hopkins has been, maybe he will play. And yet, Cooper Kupp could be the piece that makes this Kansas City Chiefs team unstoppable. Really, most teams who got Kupp would really benefit. The Washington Commanders, you add another great route runner who can get open in the short to intermediate areas, who can get open off the line with Jaden Daniels, with how quickly he's releasing the ball, with how competently Cliff Kingsbury is coordinating that offense. I think that would be very, very exciting. Colm, I don't know where the Bucs go. They're just in so much trouble now. You certainly can't give up in the position that they're in, especially with Baker Mayfield playing so well. But this is a team with a terrible defense, and now they don't have their offensive pieces. It wouldn't be surprising to see them only get a couple more wins on the year. Running backs,
they're in a position where they almost need to, they need to survive until Mike Evans gets back, and see what's happening then. But it's they're likely to come, be at least the second best team in that division, even with how tough it's going to be with the Saints and the Panthers. So the wild card is still in play, but it's just a real dagger to lose both of those guys for multiple weeks, but one of them for the entire season. And it is going to be, there's that balance, and people will be able to feel this from their dynasty teams. Do I give away a third round pick for next year? If I might just make the playoffs, or if I might get bounced straight away, versus the likes of the Commanders, who it feels like you could be. They'll be pretty frisky if they have no defense, but they'll be pretty frisky offensively if they were to make it in. You mentioned Cooper Kupp to the Commanders, Shawn. That would be either the Chiefs or the Commanders, but I think the Commanders would just be for a fun aspect. I do think that out of those players, him and potentially Diontae Johnson, they could both replicate. I don't think at this point of their careers to the same level as Rashee Rice would, but I think they could cover a lot of the ground that he would have been doing routes-wise. And that's where, as you mentioned already, I don't think Hopkins covers that. And obviously Worthy's a different player again. So both of them are very interesting. And again, to a lower level, I think Christian Kirk probably could do something similar. But his contract's obviously very problematic for the Chiefs.
Yeah, Christian Kirk is a tough one. He did not play well, even in the victory again the other night. And you're going to have a big contrast anytime that you are held up next to Brian Thomas with how fantastic Thomas has looked in the early going. But anytime they're throwing to Kirk, you're like, that's a touch where Thomas or Evan Ingram are not getting the ball. Those guys need to be the focal point. Kind of like, can we get Kendre Miller traded? This contract extension for Alvin Kamara, I think, is the last straw. Kendre Miller to, again, the Chiefs. I mean, the Chiefs still need everything on offense, right? So you could go there.
As a Chiefs fan, Shawn, are you willing to tank the entire 2025 NFL draft? Give up all those picks just to get that one more Super Bowl this year?
Well, what's Kendre Miller worth to?
Oh no, I'm not talking. I'm talking about
a
like
2027 conditional 7th round pick. I mean, they hate that guy.
A bag of balls. See, but yeah, I think it's not good long term. Again, I still think he'll be the second guy behind Kamara. But we've talked a lot about Kamara on the show in recent weeks. I was kind of astounded that they made the extension, but I mentioned on the show, I think it was on Wednesday, that they're going to be locked in, cap hell, as they seem to have kind of been, post Drew Brees as well. I think they got out of it a little bit, but they are a team who continuously like kicks the can down the road, and this contract looks to be another addition of, we're moving those dollars to a later time. We'll worry about that, when we get there. But yeah, I don't think you need to be, extending them for footballing reasons.
I think the Rico Dowdle fans would say the Dallas Cowboys don't need to acquire a running back. They need to play the guy that they do have. There is a lot of truth to that. I would also love to see Miller go to the Cowboys. Maybe Dowdle still is the nominal starter, but a 1-2 punch with those guys would be much more exciting. And there's the potential that Miller could really explode in that offense. Dallas probably a bit of a sleeping giant when you think at least offensively for the second half of the season. If you can pick up a few of their pieces at mild discounts right now, I would encourage people to do that. The Broncos have a ton of backs. Even though they've run the ball poorly, it probably doesn't make sense for an acquisition there. Houston Texans, Joe Mixon just had a fantastic game. You would give him a decent backup. I've given Mixon a hard time for his lack of evasion. And then Colm not only did have a fantastic game, but SIS loved his performance, charted him with even more evaded tackles than I was expecting. Congrats to Mixon on almost carrying his team to victory. One of the best running back performances we have seen in a long time. The Jets don't need one. The Dolphins don't need one. The Bills don't need one. The Ravens are getting Keaton Mitchell back probably, and then they will have far and away the best running back room that they have had, maybe ever, but certainly in a long, long time. Jaylen Warren, even though he didn't do much in the game, to the eyeball, he looked a lot better and healthier in week 7. They obviously have a strong 1-2 punch there. The Cincinnati Bengals could use a running back to replace all of the Zach Moss touches. Unfortunately, one of the reasons that Moss is occasionally in the game is because they like him in pass protection, and that's probably not the part that Kendre Miller is going to help you out with. So not a good fit. Do we have other running backs on the block?
I don't know if you could put him on the block based on how, but I'm just looking at it as a franchise. And if you're able to get something for somebody, we obviously have Brooks coming back for the Carolina Panthers. I think if one of the contenders was really looking for a running back, I think Chuba Hubbard would be, somebody fun to move. But I think that the team, with him being 25 now, if we were in a dynasty kind of scenario, would be looking at maybe we should move on from him. And he's had a good run. He's probably not going to have the same amount of carries moving forward with Brooks coming back in. He would be somebody I think that you could potentially look to move. As I look down through, the names here, he's the only other one that's really standing out strong to me that realistically I think a contender could go move for. The likes of, I don't think the Jaguars are going to try and move on from ETN. but maybe somebody would look at that. I think there would be too much of a cost to acquire him. But Sean, looking through the rest of them, you're looking at teams who are, with losing records, no chance to make the playoffs. The Bears have a few running backs with there and the hunt for the playoffs. Nothing there that really gets you excited about the likes of the Raiders backs, for example. So I think the teams that kind of have the riches there, I guess, could a team come in desperation and try and get Miles Sanders, for example? But I think that the one I would be looking at if I'm a contender and I want to look beyond this year too, with somebody who could be there for a couple of seasons would be Hubbard, but I don't expect him to move.
Yeah, that makes sense. Miles Sanders has been the name tossed around, but certainly he would be a viable backup to Brooks, and for a variety of reasons. You would get more for Hubbard. Whether more amounted to anything still is a more difficult question.
Or
and when you look through the different depth charts, yeah, we're again probably in a situation where only the Cowboys and the Chiefs are legitimately looking for a back. Although I think if you're the Indianapolis Colts and you think you have any shot, which they probably don't, their quarterback situation is somewhat catastrophic, both from a winning in the short term, but also like, how do we manage this season? Because are we a competitor? Is this one of the things with Anthony Richardson that is the case, and people do need to respect, even if his draft slot didn't make sense, even if he should have been more a second round reality pick, is that he's played very little football. And, it could be a couple of years before he can execute what they need to execute. In a couple of years, he might be very, very good. When you're an NFL team like the Colts, like, how do you manage the interim? But if you think
I was going to say, it's very interesting when you look at, say, the Packers now and what they're doing with Jordan Love. And obviously that was thought of as a bad pick at the time. They had Aaron Rodgers. And like the Colts now, because they didn't have an established quarterback in front of him, it probably feels like we need to put him out there. We need to have him on the field. But like realistically at the moment, Joe Flacco gives them a better chance, I think, to win games this season. But they're not going to do that and let him develop, which is probably the right move as a franchise. But they're going to, go for it this season. And I think, again, that probably costs him some of that development as well. Because, when we're looking at some of the quarterback situations around the league, there is boom plays there. But, the Colts played the Dolphins this past week, and, the Dolphins have nothing at quarterback. But there wasn't much between these two teams in terms of outside of the Russian.
Well, the Dolphins would have won if not for the Raheem Mostert fumble. So, again, it's one where if you don't put an opponent away and then you do make that catastrophic mistake, you lose the game. One of the things I do think is tricky with someone like an Anthony Richardson or a Trey Lance, who is very similar.
I was going to mention him as the comparison, when you're talking about like he hasn't played much, but unfortunately for Lance, his injuries were also completely cut him out of the picture, and then there was more quarterback competition as well.
But you look at someone like Mahomes, who sits behind Alex Smith. You think of Jordan Love, who sits behind Aaron Rodgers. And certainly there's a benefit of not having that immediate pressure. Both of those guys probably would have succeeded right away. Certainly Mahomes would have. But even if you believe there's a value in sitting them and not putting the immediate pressure on them, they had the benefit of playing a lot in college. Whereas Trey Lance and Anthony Richardson come to the NFL having barely played. And I just don't know how you can make any type of progress unless you play some football. And so the teams that drafted them put themselves in a position where they were going to have to play through the development era of those QBs just simply to give them snaps, right? So, I think that I would guess that Trey Lance is actually a little better NFL prospect than Anthony Richardson right now. But even in this game last week, there were some times when Richardson took off running and you're like, I'm not sure. Outside of Derrick Henry, have you seen a player that big run that athletically? So there's no questioning the physical tools, and there never has been. it's tough right now watching them play. And again, the other thing that makes it tough is just he did look ready in week 1 and played a very good game. You have those injuries, the inconsistency in terms of being able to go through physical reps and prepare fairly. I mean, that part is tough. So he hasn't been put in a good position through the fault of certainly not him or the coaching staff there. I don't think you can put it on the coaches. Just when you're having these inconsistent injury bouts, it makes it tough to go out there and play, especially when there's a lot of work to be done on the passing accuracy, and then probably a lot of work to be done on just the information processing that you have to go out there and navigate as a young NFL quarterback.
Yeah, I think that's all very fair. Shawn, with a hot take to finish off the show, that Trey Lance is now a better prospect here than we have with Anthony Richardson, but we will finish it there. We went a bit wild this week. We had 3 shows. I mentioned when we recorded the one on Monday, lots of stuff happened. So we got that show out early on Tuesday for people who were subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. So if you are looking for the shows once they drop, subscribe over there and get them on the audio side first, and they go up on the video usually the following day. But this show earlier, as well as usually this third show is your Friday edition. We have it here for you a little bit earlier. So another bonus for people who are subscribed. Drop us a written review on your favorite podcast app. We would appreciate that a lot. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.